This is the food chain you were taught in school, but it's a little out of date. There's someone new at the end, and it's me. This is because people consume cows, cows consume grass, and grass has totally consumed my life for several weeks now. So far I've gone from this to this, and I think it looks quite nice. Here's how I did it. First, I modeled a grass tuft in Blender and made a texture for it. If we go ahead and just place this all over the island, removing it where grass shouldn't grow, it doesn't look very good. If you want a game to have good graphics, of course shaders are important, but a Minecraft tree is always going to look like a Minecraft tree. If we want fluffy foliage, we first need to improve our models. For grass, we'll edit the normal vectors of the model to point up, which tells the sun to bounce light off the top. Then we'll randomly rotate everything, randomly adjust positions, and generate more grass to increase density. Now we can write a shader. First, let's sample a texture for color. One thing the industry doesn't want you to know is that you can use any textures you want. I've made this color palette, which we can map to the grayscale of our texture, and while I love the sunglasses emoji, it doesn't make for the most natural looking terrain. So let's just replace it with some noise, which looks much better. To get a nice wind effect, we can add a scrolling texture, which is just a texture that's sampled over time. Then we can add a little color from that to give the illusion of more complex shading, and also actually bend the vertices a bit. You want a very smooth texture for this. Anything with edges will look horribly unnatural, and it needs to tile, or else you'll notice where the texture repeats. This is looking pretty good now, but we're still just a couple SUVs away from the American suburbs. We can prevent this by adding flowers to keep away the uncultured middle class. We're able to render millions of blades of grass by doing it all in one batch, kinda like baking a million cookies all in one tray. The trade-off is that we can't change even a single blade of grass without updating the entire batch on the graphics card, which causes a massive lag spike. This is actually fine, because grass doesn't move. It's completely static. Or is it? This game has base building, and seeing grass poke through the floor is worse than 9/11. So, I remove grass where structures are placed. To support this with batching, we chop up the island into chunks, and batch the grass in each chunk. That way, we get 99% of the performance gains from batching, but we only need to update each chunk that changes. But still, we can only render so many chunks before the game slows down to a crawl. But we also don't need so many chunks at full detail. If we were painting a landscape, we wouldn't paint individual leaves in the background like we would in the foreground. We can apply the same concept to areas far away by swapping out our models for lower detail versions, which are significantly easier to render. And just like that, we have a beautiful meadow. But there are no trees, and I love trees. I want trees in the game to look as if they were painted by hand. Perfect. This tree could use some better leaves. The Witness has my favorite trees of any game, and if we look closely, their leaf textures are just a bunch of random individual leaves. I made something similar, which still looks really bad. The first and most important ingredient in our fluffy tree recipe is to edit the normals. We want them to face away from the center of each leaf clump so that light doesn't bounce around inside. These are shadow casting objects that rotate with the sun around each clump, so if we disable shadow casting on the clumps themselves, it looks a lot smoother, but the trees still cast shadows on the ground. Polygons in games generally have a front and a back, and the back is never rendered because you never see it. But our leaves are just flat textures, they're not actual models, so if we enable rendering for the back faces, we can suddenly see a lot more of our tree. Up close, however, there are still these harsh edges, which happens when polygons are almost perpendicular to the camera. We can calculate the angle to the camera of each polygon and fade it out before it gets too edgy. The edges disappear with a small fade angle, and as we increase the angle, the entire tree disappears. Everything from here is just artistic preference. I added interior shadows to each clump, which can get really dark, and also a bluish color for the parts of the tree in shadow. I'm not totally sold on this though, so leave a comment on whether you think 1 or 2 looks better. This is for my game Starboard, and if you want to help it succeed, wishlisting the game helps a lot with the Steam algorithm.